today. The Senate of the United States, led by Chuck Schumer, should have been led by Mitch McConnell, but now it's led by Chuck Schumer, is going to start the consideration on the conviction of President Trump for the impeachment charge that was brought against him by the House of Representatives. Remember, that single impeachment charge essentially suggested that Trump was responsible for inciting a riot at the Capitol building on January 6th. That was the main part of the impeachment charge. There were other ancillary parts, like his earlier call with Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, but the main part of the charge is that he was personally responsible for the incitement of the violence that happened on January 6th. Now, the big problem with that charge is really that he is not by any legal definition responsible for incitement. And it's very difficult to make the claim that he is responsible for incitement because of the colorful language that he used in the months leading up to January 6th, but that other politicians who use similarly colorful language are not also guilty of incitement when violence breaks out from people who agree with them. This is the biggest flaw in the entire Democratic argument with regard to impeachment. Now, there are some Republicans who voted for impeachment in the House. Their case is that Trump had abused his power, that he'd been lying about the results of the election, that he'd been telling lies about voter irregularity and voter fraud and whipping people into a frenzy, and that it was sort of a foreseeable effect of that something bad would happen. But again, the wording of the incitement charge is pretty specific. And beyond that, there is no neutral standard that applies across the board when it comes to an impeachable offense on the basis of this fact pattern. And that is the case that Trump's defense is making. So we're going to get to what Trump's defense looks like, because that's going to start rolling out today. The trial actually begins with a 4-hour debate today on the constitutionality of bringing an impeachment charge against a person who is no longer in office. Remember, he is former President Trump. He is not actually President Trump. And frankly, if you wanted what was best for the country, I think there's a solid case to be made that the country is better off just kind of moving on. And the reason I say that is not because Trump shouldn't bear the political consequences of what he wrought over the couple of months after the election. I think he is going to bear those political consequences in whatever way the American public sees fit to bring those consequences. I mean, the number one consequence of his behavior over the past 4 years is that he's no longer president of the United States. The simple fact of the matter is, if he had been as silent on social media during his presidency as he has been since he was banned from social media in the aftermath of January 6th, he would probably still be president. So it's not as though consequences have not attended to Trump's behavior. And the people who actually engaged in violence, those people will be tracked down. Those people will be brought to trial. Those people will spend time in jail, as well they should. And if Democrats are ever willing to bring forth evidence of their most outrageous allegations, which is that there are members of Congress who are complicit in the attack, well, then members of Congress will end up in jail. Okay, but when it comes to the question of whether it is good for the country as a broad matter for us to be relitigating Trump's presidency after he lost an election in November, or whether we ought to be focused on, the crises at hand, namely COVID, the economy, and all the rest, I think that increasingly, if there's a reason both Democrats and Republicans want to move fast on this thing. Republicans want to move fast on it because they think that it's basically just political gamesmanship, which is correct. And Democrats want to move fast on this thing because I think they recognize that if this drags out for weeks and weeks, Americans are just going to get tired of it. Because this is what happens with virtually every impeachment trial. At the very beginning of the impeachment trial over Ukraine, Americans were largely supportive of impeaching Trump by polling data. And then as the thing continued, Americans were like, what are we doing again? Why are we doing this again? What? Seriously? And you're going to get that even more now because at least at that point, Trump was president. Now, Trump's just some guy golfing in Mar-a-Lago. So the idea for most Americans that we should be expending enormous quantities of time, and not only time, by the way, cash. We're going to spend $500 million taxpayer dollars to have troops all over Washington, D.C. during this Senate impeachment trial. You know that? Now, honestly, I would love to hear members of the law enforcement community explain just why we need a completely militarized D.C. right now. Because there's been no violence since January 6th. That's not to say there couldn't be. That's not to say that maybe they don't have evidence that we haven't seen. But Governor DeSantis in Florida, Governor Abbott in Texas, they already brought home their National Guard contingent. They're like, we're not seeing a ton of fomenting violence. We're not seeing giant rallies outside the Senate today. So why exactly are we spending $500 million taxpayer dollars to keep Washington, D.C. in a state of military lockdown? I mean, just on the face of it, it's kind of bizarre. So here's how the trial is going to roll out today. According to The Hill, Senate leadership announced on Monday they've reached a deal on the framework for former President Trump's impeachment trial. It'll start today. For the information of the Senate, the Republican leader and I, in consultation with both the House managers and former President Trump's lawyers, have agreed to a bipartisan resolution to govern the structure and timing of the impending trial, said Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. Apparently, they confirmed on the right side of the aisle that this was happening. The timeline would allow the trial to wrap up as early as next week if both sides agree not to call witnesses. And this is the big question right now, is whether the sides are going to call witnesses. Under the current deal, the Senate is going to debate and vote today on whether the trial is constitutional. The effort to declare the trial unconstitutional will fall short. Rand Paul forced to vote on this issue late last month. 44 Republican senators supported that particular effort. There are very few Republicans who sided with the idea that it was constitutional. Now, that was an easy procedural way out. There are some Republicans who are making the case it's not constitutional to push forward with this. Tom Cotton from Arkansas is one of those. Here's Senator Cotton explaining the constitutional case against convicting a president of an impeachable offense after he has already left office.
I think it's beyond the Senate's constitutional authority to have an impeachment proceeding, the point of which is to convict and remove from office a man who left office 3 weeks ago. I think it's also a set of misplaced priorities. The Democrats continue to obsess about Donald Trump when Donald Trump left office and went to Florida 3 weeks ago, when the Senate should be focused on things like how to expand vaccine production and distribute it more quickly. Those are the priorities the American people want us to focus on, not an inquest into who is now a private citizen.
It's an interesting constitutional debate on the right side of the aisle. Basically, the Republicans who say that it's unconstitutional to push forward with this, that's people like Tom Cotton or Rand Paul, their case is that it is an impeachment trial. The purpose of an impeachment trial is to remove from office a person who apparently is now already out of office. So what exactly is the point? And on the other side of the aisle, there are people who say, yes, he was impeached in the House, but the conviction is still part of the process. That happens in the Senate. And one of the possibilities is barring somebody from running for office in the future on the basis of a Senate conviction. So here's Pat Toomey, who's a Republican senator from Pennsylvania, making the opposite case.
You did have 45 Republican senators vote to suggest that they didn't think it was appropriate to conduct a trial. So you can infer how likely it is that those folks will vote to convict. I disagreed with their assessment. I think it is constitutional. I think it's clearly constitutional to conduct a Senate trial with respect to an impeachment. In this case, the impeachment occurred prior to the president's leaving office.
Okay, so how is this actually going to roll out? The way that this is actually going to roll out is the opening arguments then start on Wednesday. So under the current deal, the House impeachment managers and Trump's team will have 16 hours over 2 days each to present their case to the Senate, which is actually a faster pace than the first Trump trial. Both sides got 24 hours in that Trump trial. At that point, Chuck Schumer was like, we're rushing this thing even now, because Mitch McConnell was in charge. Now, Chuck Schumer wants to rush this thing so much that both sides get 16 hours to present their case. And you can bet money that if the Democrats start calling witnesses, like if they start calling up AOC to testify to how terrified she was in the building that was, 0.3 miles away from the Capitol building, protected by police and was never under assault from rioters, if they want to call people like AOC, then you can certainly bet Republicans will then call AOC to rebut AOC and ask her about her own violent language with regard to Republicans and riots and all of the rest. The way this is going to work is if one side opens that can of worms with regard to impeachment witnesses, you can bet the other side certainly will as well. The deal does leave open the door to calling witnesses. The House impeachment managers previously invited Trump to testify under oath. His attorneys rejected that because if you are Trump's attorney, the last thing you ever want is Donald Trump in a legal proceeding saying anything. It is the worst job in the world being Donald Trump's attorney. You can tell because of the churn. I mean, seriously, that is a bad job because the first rule of lawyering is that you get your client to shut up. And then you are the one who is the mouthpiece for your client. But that is not Donald Trump's forte, is shutting up. And so being Donald Trump's lawyer is always difficult. Although there are reports out today that Donald Trump, shockingly, has finally learned that actually his best PR tactic may be to not say things. Apparently, he's like off on the golf courses and people around him are telling him, people are still paying attention to you. And you using your social media sparingly as opposed to using it like, just word vomit. Like that's actually an effective tactic, and Trump seems to have learned that, which is why he's making so few public statements. Would to God that he had learned that in the first year of his presidency. Both sides are going to end up with 2 hours for closing arguments. Chuck Schumer says, as in previous trials, there will be equal time for senator questions and for closing arguments, and an opportunity for the Senate to hold deliberations if it so chooses. And then we're going to vote on the articles of impeachment. So that is the procedure as it is going to play out. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it's a fact that The Ben Shapiro Show is the largest conservative podcast in the nation. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to stay up to date on all of our content.